I mentioned cognitive biases in the recording about the limits of personal experiences. Those faulty ways of thinking can influence a wide range of behaviors and experiences, sometimes with pretty substantial negative effects. Given that, we'll look into some specific forms of cognitive bias in more detail in this module. In another recording, I mentioned that we're not using bias in the sense of social discrimination, but rather in the sense of favoring something. More specifically, favoring one type of information or knowledge. That overall idea is really broad, though, which makes it tricky to make a list of the most important biases. One of the readings for this unit, the article in The Atlantic, said that the related Wikipedia page listed 185 specific forms of cognitive bias. The same article also mentioned that an agency created by the U.S. government identified 6 biases that were important from the perspective of national intelligence. But some of the biases in that list don't appear in psychology textbooks. And what's my point? Good question. Collectively, these ideas suggest a lack of consensus among the scholars, and as a result, we talk about the same concept in different contexts, sometimes with different meanings. You might notice the different context as you read the textbook. The concepts I'm including in the category of cognitive biases are discussed in a few chapters of the Thinking Like a Psychological Scientist without ever using the term cognitive bias. That said, we'll focus on 9 cognitive biases related to research literacy. Each of the 9 influences how we process information, and therefore, their areas of research literacy can increase the accuracy of our thinking. In thinking about these 9 biases, I tend to group them like I did in this slide, with some related to heuristics, others related to estimating errors, and others related to information errors. Heuristics is a psychological term for the shortcuts and rules of thumb that we use to make judgments and decisions more efficiently. The availability heuristic and representativeness heuristic are 2 of the more commonly referenced biases in this area. The availability heuristic is related to what is most memorable for us, in other words, what's most available in our memory. The representativeness heuristic is related to how we group and categorize things and people in our world, which therefore influences how we group and categorize information, things, and people that are new to us. The resources in the course site include several examples for both types of heuristics. Each of the biases I refer to as estimating errors are related to our direct or indirect estimates of something happening, or a variation between 2 amounts. The anchoring effect is when the first piece of information we have overly influences our thinking. One way to think of it is that the first piece of information is like a boat anchor in the water. It limits how far the boat can move. It's like the first piece of information can limit the way we think about what we discover later. Base rate neglect refers to a tendency to adopt beliefs or make decisions without taking into account what's known about the likelihood of related events. This can overlap with the influence of anecdotes. In another recording, I mentioned the example of people who won't wear seatbelts because they know someone who would have died if they'd been wearing a seatbelt when they were in a car accident. Relying on anecdotes in situations like that is also an example of base rate neglect. The framing effect is when the way something is presented influences our view or perception. I thought about this effect when I was reading a news story about a nurse practitioner who's accused of misprescribing pain medication. The author said they'd been in practice nearly half a decade instead of saying it 4 years. It made me think the author was trying to frame it so it would seem like he was in practice longer. The last bias I put in this category is the gambler's fallacy. This comes up most frequently when there's a pattern that can be seen as a streak, like a winning streak or a losing streak. If we think the next game or drawing or coin flip is somehow related to the previous ones, we're demonstrating the gambler's fallacy. The 3 biases I refer to as information errors influence the information we seek and how we interpret it. The confirmation bias refers to our tendency to seek information that's consistent with what we already believe. That makes me think of another phenomenon called the self-fulfilling prophecy. With the self-fulfilling prophecy, we behave in a way that's consistent with our initial beliefs, and we influence others in a way that makes their behavior consistent with our initial beliefs. With confirmation bias, our initial beliefs influence the information we seek and attend to, so it's much less likely we find information that's inconsistent with our beliefs. In other words, we confirm our understanding because we don't seek disconfirming information. The fundamental attribution error is the tendency to emphasize the characteristics of a person in thinking about the cause of their behavior instead of thinking about the situation. For example, if someone's going really fast on the highway and passing with little room to spare, we might think they're really an aggressive driver, or they must be really irresponsible, both of which are attribution errors. They might just be trying to get to the hospital for a birth or something similarly urgent. The last bias I have in this category is called the hindsight bias. And this is when we find out the conclusion or outcome and essentially think, I knew that was going to happen. It's sort of like the after-the-fact counterpart to confirmation bias. When we reflect on something, we might emphasize the memories that are consistent with the outcome or conclusion, like we do when we seek confirming information with a confirmation bias. Earlier I mentioned that each of the 9 cognitive biases we'll focus on represent areas where research literacy can increase the accuracy of our thinking. That's not necessarily because knowing about the biases helps us avoid them, though, and it doesn't necessarily mean that research literacy can reduce them. At this point, the question of whether cognitive biases can be reduced is a matter of debate. The article from The Atlantic explains participants in the debate and their positions, so I'll let you get the details there. The fact that this information is included in class suggests my position, but it isn't that I think there's strong evidence the bias can be changed. Instead, I don't think there's strong evidence that biases can't be changed given the way the issues are defined and studied.